Excellent. Welcome to this new conversation on sounds like sustainability, all around climate change, climate action, and sustainability and what it might be and how we reflect on that. And I'm very happy to welcome Suzi Clark on board. And I would love to hand right over to you, Suzi, if you would briefly introduce yourself and maybe talk a bit about what are the sounds that you can hear at the moment around you. And how is this related to who you are and where you are and what you do in your life? Very welcome.
So thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I am a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota, and my formal training officially is oceanography. And then I moved from the coasts into the very heart of the country. And here I'm working on climate adaptation research. And I'm part of the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. And our main goal as an organization is to help people in the state of Minnesota to prepare for a changing climate, and in particular to prepare to adapt to a changing climate. So rather than talking about reducing carbon emissions, we're talking about climate change is already here. What do we need to do in order to handle that fact? And what do we need to do in the upcoming decades to make sure that we are ready to prepare for these changes? And so the sounds that I hear around me, I live in a very urban setting. I live in the warehouse district of Minneapolis, actually. So I hear a lot, and I'm also on the 6th floor of an apartment building. So I hear a lot of trucks going past, but we do actually have quite a few trees around. So I can hear some birds, and I can hear all the leaves rustling, which is a development in the last week or so, since all the trees really kind of budded with the summer season. And so they're actually pretty loud. It almost sounds like water sometimes. That's something I didn't really grow up with because I didn't grow up here. I didn't grow up in a place with many trees. And how it relates to sustainability, that's one of the questions. Well, I think there's kind of two aspects. There's the urban sounds and the nature sounds. And the urban sounds kind of constantly remind me of where we live in as part of human society and the effect that we have had through our development on the makeup of the earth. And even when we go out onto our balcony, we can hear all of the HVAC systems, all of the heating and cooling systems humming and buzzing. And then if you go down by the river, then you can hear the water and you can hear the trees. And that's more of the nature component. And something I think a lot of in my work, and that I'm reminded of daily, is the intersection between the environment and human society and how we interact with each other. So.
And is there a specific human nature relationship that is associated with sustainability? So how would you describe sustainability, and what kind of human nature is represented in kind of our, like, a common sense or a common belief of sustainability?
So I think that, first of all, the word sustainability is a really tricky one, which I think is probably what motivated these conversations, because it doesn't have one definition and people often use it for greenwashing, unfortunately. But I think when we think of the human nature relationship, something that I really wish we could change our perspective on is this idea that we're somehow separate from Earth systems. And I've believed in this very strongly ever since I first started at undergrad, that we're not separate at all. We have a massive effect on Earth systems and they have an effect on us. We are still part of the system as much as we sometimes live disconnected from it. And so I think in terms of sustainability, there's a need to put ourselves back into the Earth system and realize how we fit into it. And once we start doing that, and once we start realizing the effects that we have on other beings and the effects that they have on us, then we can start finding the path towards sustainability.
I really love this idea of reconnection, and kind of that we as humans have to learn how to embed ourselves in kind of the Earth system from a broader perspective, but then from a more narrow perspective, like really our locality, like what is happening around us. And I would love to talk a bit about how we can actually do that. But maybe before we can take a bit of time to think about it, like what might be a way to do that. Before, I would love to stick a bit with this definitely pretty blurry or wicked term of sustainability. You talked a bit about greenwashing and that it's used and abused quite a bit. By the same time, I think it is somehow related to this climate change crisis narrative. So there is this kind of like, this is really a crisis. This is really going to be really bad. But by the same time, there's this story that mostly corporates tell about how the future might be look like and beautiful technological solutions about the future. So how do you see this relationship? Is it a relationship? Maybe I'm kind of misled here with my background. How is sustainability related to this narrative of climate change and the climate crisis?
So I had actually written down some thoughts on that. So if you'll allow me to consult my notes, they're probably a bit more cohesive than what I could think of on the fly. But I think that they are definitely related, because in order to face the crisis that is climate change, we need to make massive adjustments in our behavior. We need to change how we consume resources, how we produce waste, how we burn fossil fuels. The list goes on and on. And I think that if you are trying to mitigate climate change, in other words, reduce its effects, then you inherently are becoming more sustainable. Because our current mode is unending economic growth, which by definition is not sustainable because nothing can grow forever. And so if you are trying to find a more kind of cyclical process that doesn't abuse resources as much and doesn't produce as much waste, doesn't burn as many fossil fuels, is more reliant on renewable energy, a cyclical process by definition is sustainable. But I think that they're related, but they're not necessarily the same thing. First, because climate change cannot be addressed only by sustainability measures. We also, as I mentioned, have to think about adapting to climate change. And that's something that at this point is, it's kind of the reality that we are going to face changes regardless. If we stopped emitting all fossil fuel carbon emissions right now, stopped burning fossil fuels, we would still deal with climate change because of the delay in the Earth system and how it responds. So that can't be, trying to be more sustainable cannot be our only approach to climate change. It has to be part of the solution. And then I think conversely, so climate change is only one of the many environmental challenges that is addressed by trying to be sustainable, because there are other issues such as biodiversity, or for example, overfishing is a really concrete good example. These all might be related to climate change, but there's other factors that go into it, such as how much fish we're taking out of the ocean versus how quickly it's replenished. And so there are issues of sustainability related to that, for example, that are not necessarily directly climate change. So I would put them as a Venn diagram, I guess. They have overlapping spheres, but then they also have aspects that are unique to the different problems.
I really like what you said at the beginning, that if we start to tackle those climate change related issues and problems and challenges, then we are sustainable kind of automatically. So do we need sustainability as a framework?
I think so. I think for a couple of reasons. First, because I mentioned that there's problems that are not exactly climate change that we still need to consider. Destruction of rainforests, for example. If we stop needing to produce new palm oil, then we won't need to destroy the rainforests. And second, or if we stop wanting to clear it for cattle grazing, which is apparently one of the main reasons that they're burned down these days. But in addition to the fact that there's other things that sustainability applies to, I think it's also sometimes more easily grasped. And so when you're communicating with people on the whole who may not be as welcome to the idea of climate change, Or they might have, which is a very common challenge here in the US, and I know it's a common challenge in Australia as well, unfortunately. Yeah, so they might be more receptive to the idea of sustainability than to the idea of combating climate change. What they don't realize is that you're actually kind of getting them to do both.
Mhm.
And it's also easier to visualize. Climate change is a really hard thing to grasp because of the time scale and the spatial scales at which it happens. And it's so disconnected from what we experience on the day-to-day because the processes occur on our averaged over several decades. And I think sustainability, it's much easier to show this, recycle, reduce, reuse triangle with the 3 little arrows to illustrate how we should change our behavior. So I think for those sorts of conversations, sustainability is still a very helpful framework.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I would love to, by the same time, I would love to challenge that because
Okay.
So my sound, let's start with my sound. I brought a sound. So this is a real cup with my, and probably everyone in the room knows that carrying around a keep cup, especially at universities or at your workplace, is one of those beautiful tokens that are used, as you said, easy. You talk about you talk about that you
I have one.
talk about, sure, I have like,
yeah.
and a couple of universities are trying to offer that to students more and all that. So a keep cup or a reusable water bottle up, I think one of the most tokenistic icons of sustainability, especially when we talk about this individual behavior level. And yes, I fully agree that sustainability, because it's a kind of positive story, a future looking positive story that is easier to communicate. But don't you think that having these tokens introduced, that people start to feel like, oh, I have my keep cup, I've done my bit, excellent.
100%.
So
I was actually just
get more. How can we get better? Like tapping into the space of activating, engaging, because then it gets to the point where people are like, oh, I'm doing really good. I have my water bottle, I have my keep cup, and sometimes I use my bike. And so, well done me.
That's a really good point. And I was actually just thinking of that not too long ago, because I remember when I was in high school, everyone still used plastic water bottles because people were just realizing, like, oh, I need to carry water around all the time, so I'm going to use my plastic water bottle. And it was somewhere when I was in, I think, college that we started shifting to these. And now it's like everyone I know carries a reusable water bottle or something along those lines. And I started thinking the other day, how many unnecessary reusable water bottles are currently floating around that were actually way more energy intensive to produce and are just getting thrown to the waste. So it brings up a really good point about individual actions and this kind of idea that you can make yourself feel better by doing a couple of things and saying, okay, I'm good. But then meanwhile, you hop on a plane with your, reusable water bottle, which I did just this last week. I'm not pointing any fingers. So yeah, I'm trying to think of your question, which is how do we get beyond that?
Beyond the tokenism. So I think that it's people, as you can probably see in the chat, are really kind of like, like people do collect keep cups, and the good side is if people really start to value that and put stickers on it and make it a cool item to carry around. But then of course you have the flip side of people collecting it, and from a communication perspective, it is really interesting how this tokenism then is like it you can immediately then reallocate responsibility to either someone else, or what happens mostly to corporates or political institutions or political players out there, on which level, national, international, whatever. And I think this is one of the key questions in this game: who is responsible, and how is the process of, okay, I take responsibility or I allocate it to somewhere else or someone else, how much is this related to how much engaged I am, how much I go out of my comfort zone, beyond my normality, and do things more than keep calm.
Yeah,
I'm not quite
I
sure how you can connect your thinking about climate activism and engagement to that, but I think the responsibility question does play a role in this.
I struggle a lot with the responsibility question because I think that placing responsibility on individuals is a bit of a diversionary tactic, unfortunately, because we have an unfortunate, very good example now from the beginning of the pandemic. Everyone stopped traveling. We didn't go anywhere, and it didn't make a dent in the carbon emissions. And so it's like, how can you then say that it's individual choices that are going to make the difference? But at the same time, I don't want people to then just give up. I don't want people to then say, well, my choices don't matter. I'll do whatever. I think waste is a particular one where individual choice can make a difference. If you're really conscientious about waste associated with fast food, waste associated with the products you buy, that sort of thing. But then at the same time, upstream, there's still so much waste that's generated before the product even gets to you. And I think that with climate change and with carbon emissions, it's quite a kind of the same challenge, where you can choose to drive an electric car and you can choose to put solar panels on your roof, and that's great, and you should do that. But at the same time, there's so much that's emitted upstream that you never even see. And so I think the answer would be a little bit of both, if I'm going to give a bit of a cop-out answer.
Question about this kind of communication perspective, because if we think about what is happening up the stream, like what is happening before we then get into the situation where we can make different choices, is this a communication problem? So do we need more information about what is happening there to then make better choices? Or are we better off following the logic of like, oh, sustainability, like let's keep it easy and let's keep it positive? Shouldn't we know that? Because then we fall back into this like eco-anxiety, or this kind of like, oh, too much.
I think we definitely should talk about what's happening upstream. One of my favorite little videos that I watched, it must be 15 years old now, is The Story of Stuff. And again, this is about waste production, which is a bit easier to grasp than climate change. But yeah, great video. I'm glad someone else has seen it. That was a huge wake-up call for me. And that was actually one of the things that I can pinpoint as me wanting to go into environmental science, was watching that video. I think it's very important to talk about what goes on that feels beyond our individual choice control. And that is necessary in communication, because it's important to recognize the complexity and the scale of the challenge. And issues like that, I think, they're better addressed by collective action. So there's some things we can do by changing our individual choices, but there's other things we can do by creating collective pressure on either the corporations, which does actually work. If you boycott a product, then that can create pressure on a company to change some of their tactics, or to put pressure on governments and politicians to implement restrictions, and the word is failing me right now, but to implement laws that basically regulate that.
So I really like this kind of idea of it needs to be a complementary. It's like about individual action, about collective action. Let's get back to this point we talked about at the beginning, like what are ways that we can get more connected to our locality to kind of restore this relationship between us, and maybe be a bit more conscious about what is happening exactly around us, and learn from there, instead of applying some concepts that are communicated to us, like, oh, carry a Cape Cup, do this, go on your bike, don't fly, don't travel. So how can we restore this human nature relationship that we talked about? Is this something that you have to do more individually in your kind of very own space, or is it something that can happen collectively as well, in your experience, like in terms of activism
Mhm. I think it can happen both ways. I think some individual ways it can happen are to be more connected with where your food comes from.
Mhm.
For example, last summer I participated in a program called Community Supported Agriculture, CSA, where you commit to purchase produce from a farmer throughout the duration of the growing season. And it's a win-win situation because the subscribers get fresh produce from a local source, and the farmers get guaranteed income for the duration of the season, regardless of what happens with their crop. And it was a really enlightening experience for me because last summer, Minnesota actually had a drought. And every week when they sent out our boxes, they also sent out an email newsletter explaining the challenges that they were facing growing the food. And that was really interesting because they said things like, we're sorry that the apples are so small, they've had a really hard time, but we promise that they're really sweet. And that's so different from going to a grocery store and having this perfect selection of produce brought in from all over the world. So that's one way I can think of as an individual action. And then also just spending more time away from whatever bubble you live in. So we all, especially in the Western world, we live in these really strong bubbles, really disconnected from our environment. And whatever you can do to break out of that bubble, I think is really good, whether that's going on a nature walk or whether that's connecting with people who live in a very different environment. I heard a great quote from, who was this? Yes, it was at a conference I went to last week. Someone said, if you're not feeling the effects of climate change, then some degree of privilege is protecting you from it. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a really good statement. Mm-hmm. And she's right, people all around the world are feeling the very real effects of climate change in their daily lives. And if you're not, then that means that you are shielded in some way, either by where you live or the money that you make or what have you. Collectively, to try to reconnect, I'm trying to think of something that's a bit beyond organizations that plant trees, which is very important, don't get me wrong, but I'm trying to think of something a little bit more out of the box than that. I'm unfortunately coming up short at the moment, but I don't think that it has to stop at individual action. Absolutely.
What I really like, and this is probably my last question, and then we can open up for questions from who's here. So firstly, I really like this idea of connecting with people who live in a very different context, and it does not necessarily have to be Kenya or Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be that, but by the same time, I think as someone living in an urban bubble or space, to then really get connected with someone like the farmer who talks about the apples is awesome. My question to you, like as a scholar, as an academic, as someone who teaches and who is in these networks, don't we have like an ethical duty to kind of do more, not necessarily just lead by example, but to do something? Like what can we do in this role? Do you have any ideas on that?
I absolutely believe that we have a responsibility to do more. And I know that there are some people in the academic realm who think that their job is to do the science, to remain completely impartial, and to put the information out there and let it speak for itself. I am not in that camp. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if the name Naomi Oreskes rings a bell for you, but she's a very well-known, in the US, she's a very well-known advocate for basically society and nature reconnecting. Mm-hmm. Yes, Merchants of Doubt. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I missed a letter on the end of her last name. Just typed it into the chat. I saw something that she said several years ago. You don't have to advocate for policy, but you can advocate for your science. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you can be an advocate for the information that you are learning. And you can say, I'm not just going to put this into an academic journal and let it sit there and hope someone reads it. No one besides a fellow scientist is going to read your academic article. I'm sorry. And so you need to advocate for your science. And I think that's one way we can absolutely do more. And I had jotted down a few more ideas as well. I think we can do more to help people grasp concepts that feel abstract or that feel disconnected, particularly climate change, for example, because it can be so hard to wrap your mind around it. And as people who are so intimately familiar with these abstract concepts, we can do more to help translate it out of science lingo into everyday lingo. Even if we ourselves are not the ones doing the translating, you can partner with somebody and you can help explain the science and work with someone who's an experienced communicator to do that. And then I also think that there's this phrase called the spiral of silence. It's, you know it, okay, yeah. It's
it was like one of the first German communication scholars who is behind that, Elisabeth Müller-Neumann. She kind of
I did not.
that. And she is from
Yes.
kind of a city that's called Mainz, close to Frankfurt, and she was one of our grand dames of communication studies in Germany. That is,
I didn't realize. Yeah, I didn't realize that she was German, but that makes sense now that oftentimes Americans also have Germanic last names. And so it's hard to know where the person's actually from. But yeah, it's essentially the process where you don't talk about something. And so everyone assumes that everyone else doesn't think it's important. So they don't talk about it. And we just go down and down and no one talks about it. But if we can break that, one of my favorite statistics is that actually 70% of Americans believe in climate change. You would never guess that from regular discourse or from media. And that's because, I think, in my opinion, because of the spiral of silence. But if we can break that, that's something that we as scientists can contribute to get the conversation going.
Excellent. So there are a few really beautiful comments on the chat.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly, pointing out to like the interview series for climate change, like that a master student of you talked about this issue of, I assume, kind of this responsibilities as a researcher and how we can deal with that. Are there any more questions in the chat, or are there any further comments? It's a conversation, so I'm very happy for everyone to just speak up, ask questions, comment on things we tapped.
I think if I could just jump in, Suzi made a great point about that notion of advocating for the science, because that's definitely a distinction that that's there in the literature, and one that certainly from memory, because it was a couple of years since my master's student did that project, that came up, you know, the comfort that climate change researchers have in kind of advocating. It was really, actually, one of the really interesting things that I remember from her interviews was that they often, because of the kind of conflict and disagreement that exists around, an issue like climate change, and I guess it speaks a little bit to spiral silence, is that they'll often not talk about what they do, if they're in a social setting, so, there's some settings in which they might consider, advocating, and others in which they might sort of just, really sidestep the issue, which, is problematic. If you're someone who's a climate scientist or doing climate change research, to not actually have those conversations with people is, one way in which the messages don't get out. Thanks, Suzi.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much. And I really like this idea of these role shifts that we always have. Like we have our private life and then the science one, and then we go to conferences, and of course, like we learn a bit of boldness and kind of valuing our research and our science. But by the same time, it's very different if you start to advocate for that, and if you really want to kind of make something out of the information and want to stimulate engagement and empower other people more than just students in your teaching. And then you're a teacher, by the same time you want to inspire. Like there are a lot of different roles. I think it's very important to think about those, kind of ethics or ethical duties related to our role, at least doing research in this area. Are there any other kind of questions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, just really quickly, since I'm out of academia right now and I'm doing a lot of local work, and I'm finding that it's the neighborhood piece also becomes really important. And so we talk about issues at the local level, and it's a way, and sometimes it's not specifically around an issue. It could be around gardening, or it could be around I'm in California, so fire and drought, so that's where we're finding that a lot of the communication is happening, and then we take it into local government levels as well.
I like this perspective. Suzi, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think a local government level is key, especially in the US, where things are not likely to come from the top down. In the US, things tend to happen more at a local level, and then they coalesce, and then they happen at a state level, and then they can kind of go up and up. And it's interesting. I actually grew up in California. I lived there through college. And that's a really good example of the neighborhood by neighborhood difference, because this neighborhood is at a higher risk and this neighborhood is not. This neighborhood has the money to combat the fire risk. This neighborhood does not. And I agree that that's a really important factor when you're talking about these sorts of issues. Here in Minneapolis, I know that there's, unfortunately, there's a huge discrepancy between tree canopy and between neighborhoods that correlates very strongly with income level. So the neighborhoods that are at the highest risk of urban heat island effect are the ones with the fewest trees and the ones with the lowest incomes.
Yeah. I think that is a huge potential, especially for communication researchers, to explore those neighborhood conversations and to explore this space and what type of action is happening here. And maybe this can be a pathway to an answer to how can we get into this collective action. And collectivity does not necessarily need to be bound to an organization or an NGO or the Extinction Rebellions, which is awesome. But by the same time, there are, as Mari said, there are those beautiful connections, and it's about gardening. It's about, hey, we're going for a trip. Can you kind of watch the house? And like things that are happening even between kids, and this is where so much strength and so much communication is actually happening. This is where inspiration can happen. And this is what I think it's a very, very valuable pathway. Kelly?
I was thinking about that point that you raised earlier, which I think is a bit of a vexed question and point of discussion for amongst anyone doing research in the space, which is, that kind of individual versus collective action conundrum. And, I think realistically, given the challenges of climate change, we have to have we have to have, governments, policy and, infrastructure and, we don't have the time for, building kind of individual action. I think that where I see the value of the, individual, kind of thinking about what they do, the individual's attitudes, their level of concern, is in kind of creating the social norms about what is acceptable and what is not, and what we expect from a government, and in Australia recently we had a federal election, and for the very first time, we've been in a kind of the climate culture wars for a number of years, not as bad, not as kind of fractious as the US, but not making progress on climate policy. And for the first time, there was a kind of sense of people, or some people at least, voting on the basis of climate change. And if you haven't had that kind of bottom up, and that's happening from both individuals and and environmental groups, the environmental movement are helping to create those conversations about, you know, what's important and what we need to do and what needs to be done. So I think that that's the real value of the role of the individual is, you know, is in that kind of trying to influence the political process. That's my 2 cents.
And there's also research to back that up, that people are much more likely to engage in environmental actions if they see their neighbors in their community doing it.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Simon.
Right, hello.
Hey.
Hi, and I've got the video on. Oh no, here we go. It's
There it goes.
obviously a lot warmer where you all are than where I am.
Opposite hemispheres.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the same, what we're all talking about now. I was thinking about how to motivate people to move from that local community thing, or just individual choices like the keep cups, or larger community issues like with the gardening, like with this farming example you talked about, Suzi. But I agree that this other side, the corporate boycotts and this kind of thing, is very powerful, for legislative change and things like that. And I was wondering if anyone had an opinion, or if you know of sort of work that's being done to make this transition from this community or individual interest in what's happening and recognition of I need to do something, to this more, considering the urgency of what's happening, a more powerful and immediate impact people could have in a larger scale, I suppose, in a collective scale.
I can think of a couple of kind of local regional groups that are here in Minnesota. There's one called the Climate Advocacy Lab, I believe. I want to double check that name. But the purpose of that organization is to teach people to advocate in whatever way they think is important. And it's to help teach people to organize within their communities. So the purpose of the organization is to create organizers. That's one example I can think of, but of course that's a very regionally focused example.
And yeah, as Kelly points out, there is Robin Gulliver, who's a postdoc at our department at the moment, and she did this amazing research on environmental groups in Australia, starting with like a historical picture and how they moved and the issues they deal with and everything. And one of the points, as Kelly mentions, is that those environmental groups do have a larger impact if they tackle like the big ones and not just focusing on getting more of the individuals on board. If I interpret it right, Kelly, but correct me if I'm wrong here.
Well, I think there's always, what Robin has shown through different research she didn't talk about the other day, is that they're often kind of looking for the volunteers and people. But interestingly, environmental campaigns that focus on corporates, like businesses and corporates are the most success. I think because businesses and corporations are very sensitive to public opinion, in a way that, interestingly, we think that politicians will be, but politicians are in the pockets of vested interests, right? They have they have a lot of big donors who are putting money in their coffers, and they're actually often have more of an eye to those donors than necessarily the electorate. Whereas businesses, they need, people to purchase their stuff. And so, reputation, or damage to reputation is really key to them. So they can be very sensitive to environmental campaigns, is what Robin has shown in her research. She's shown that they can be, you can get greater success through targeting them. I thought that was I found that kind of surprising. I hadn't, before she did the research, I wouldn't have hypothesized that was necessarily the case. But now that I see that, I go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can do the post hoc reasoning for why that might be.
Good. Awesome. So many really good and important aspects. Is there anything else that, any further comments or questions?
Can I ask Suzi a question? Because I noticed that your focus is on climate adaptation. So, and I did just kind of Google you, of course. And
I hope good things popped up.
and so that you're working for the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, or helping to develop, I think. And so, I mean, I'm just interested in, because that, like, adaptation is obviously, you know, in lots of ways, like a really important part of, you know, what we should be focusing on in research. But it's interesting. It's understandable that there's more interest, I think, in mitigation, but, you know, adaptation is also an incredibly important topic. And I don't know, I wouldn't mind. I mean, do you have a couple of minutes to tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing? Is that all right for me to ask that?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So for anyone who tunes in and watches the recording, the IPCC, we differentiate between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation in the climate change world is when we try to actually prevent CO2 from entering the atmosphere. So talking about renewable energy, carbon capture, those sorts of things. Adaptation is our response to climate change. So talking about climate change is happening, what are we going to do as it happens? So I didn't really intend to go into adaptation necessarily. I was really driving towards a career in communication, science communication in general, and ended up in this role through my postdoc advisor, who was hired just 2 years ago to work on adaptation in Minnesota. And my role with the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, or MCAP, has been around for about a decade and has consisted primarily as a conference that celebrates work in adaptation across the state. And since my advisor was hired, we've been working to turn it into what we call a boundary organization, basically the bridge between the research that's happening at the university and the people who need the information to make decisions. And so my role at the organization is just a whole bunch of different things. It's a mix of research, so trying to figure out what information do people need in order to adapt to climate change, and how can we best tailor the information to them to serve those needs. Also some communication. I do a lot of work translating climate research into applicable information that's more usable, and also organization building and networking. So I've been doing a lot of work trying to assess what the current landscape looks like with regards to adaptation work across the Midwest, and where can our organization fit into that niche? Like, where is our niche and how can we fit in to fill any gaps? Thank you. It's been very enlightening. I've actually been incredibly encouraged by the work that people are already doing. And I find that one of the biggest gaps is there's so many people doing excellent work in this space, and they just aren't necessarily connected to each other. And so I think the biggest challenge is creating the network so that we are not duplicating efforts, but rather helping to multiply each other's consequences. Exactly.
Awesome. I really like that. And I think this was a very encouraging and looking forward end of a wonderful discussion. So I will stop the recording here and would like to thank everyone who's listening.